transformations in the medieval history of South Asia, as it moved from being a dominantly Buddhist society to embracing Islam in the 12th century. To understand this transformation, one must examine the geographical position of the islands, the early history of settlement, the long tradition of Buddhism, and the eventual influence of trade, travelers, and missionaries who reshaped the spiritual identity of the nation. The Maldives, though geographically isolated in appearance, were never truly cut off from the wider networks of the Indian Ocean. Instead, they were strategically located on major sea routes that connected the Arabian Peninsula, East Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. This placement meant that the islands were constantly interacting with sailors, traders, and travelers of different faiths, including Hindus, Buddhists, Christians, and Muslims. The adoption of Islam in the Maldives was not merely a matter of chance or sudden imposition. Rather, it was the culmination of centuries of contact, exchanges, and local transformations that eventually aligned the islands with the Islamic world. The earliest settlers of the Maldives are believed to have arrived from the Indian subcontinent, particularly from regions corresponding to today's Kerala and Sri Lanka. These early communities brought with them elements of Indic culture, language, and religious practices. Linguistic evidence, such as the Divehi language, which is part of the Indo-Aryan family, and archaeological findings point to close cultural affinities with both South India and Sri Lanka. Before the rise of Islam, Buddhism had been the dominant religion in the islands for centuries. The spread of Buddhism from India into Sri Lanka and further into Southeast Asia also found its way into the Maldives, probably between the 3rd century BCE and the early centuries of the Common Era. This was facilitated by the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka's promotion of Buddhism as a state-supported religion and its active dissemination through missionaries. The Maldives thus became part of a larger Buddhist cultural sphere, which included Sri Lanka, southern India, and Southeast Asian polities such as those in present-day Thailand and Indonesia. Archaeological remains across the islands testify to the deep roots of Buddhism in Maldivian history. Excavations have uncovered stupas, monasteries, and statues, particularly in places like Thodu, Gan, and Istu. Large Buddhist mounds and relics show that the religion was not superficial but firmly established as a way of life, shaping the moral and philosophical outlook of the islanders. Moreover, Maldivian Buddhist art reflects stylistic influences from Sri Lanka and India, highlighting cultural interconnections. For several centuries, Buddhism served as the unifying spiritual and cultural identity of the Maldives, even though Hinduism and local folk beliefs coexisted. Despite its Buddhist orientation, the Maldives were never insulated from wider Indian Ocean networks. Arab traders began frequenting the region from the early centuries of Islam, as the Indian Ocean was central to the flourishing maritime trade between the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia. By the 8th and 9th centuries, Muslim merchants had established strong trading communities along the coasts of Gujarat, Kerala, and Sri Lanka. These same merchants also extended their routes into the Maldives, attracted by the abundance of cowrie shells, which were used as currency in Africa and parts of Asia, as well as dried tuna and coconuts. The Maldives became an essential stopover point for resupplying water and food in the long voyages across the Indian Ocean. The recurring presence of Muslim traders in Maldivian harbors gradually created familiarity with Islamic customs and beliefs among the locals. Over time, these interactions were no longer limited to commercial exchanges but extended into cultural and religious influences. Islam's first impression in the Maldives did not come through conquest or military force but through peaceful means, primarily through trade and missionary work. Unlike the northern parts of India where Islamic expansion sometimes involved warfare, the Indian Ocean islands experienced Islam as part of the fabric of mercantile and cultural networks. Sailors and traders who brought textiles, spices, and goods also brought their daily practices of prayer, fasting, and other rituals, which naturally intrigued the local population. The Maldives' reliance on maritime trade meant that the ruling elites could not afford to ignore the customs and influence of powerful Muslim traders who controlled vast commercial networks across the ocean. This gave Islam a practical as well as spiritual appeal in Maldivian society. The traditional Maldivian account of the island's conversion to Islam is preserved in the national oral history and in texts such as the Tariq and local chronicles. According to these traditions, Islam was formally introduced in the year 1153 CE during the reign of King Dovemi, who later took the Muslim name Sultan Muhammad al-Adil. A well-known legend attributes the conversion to the visit of Abu al-Barakat, a Muslim scholar and traveler, who is said to have persuaded the king and the people to embrace Islam. The story often involves a dramatic narrative of how the islands were plagued by a sea demon or jinn that demanded human sacrifices, and how Abu al-Barakat rid the Maldives of this menace by invoking the name of Allah and reciting verses from the Quran. Moved by this act, the king and his subjects accepted Islam. While this legend carries mythical elements, it reflects the perception that Islam arrived as a liberating and protective force, rescuing the people from old superstitions and offering a new spiritual framework. Scholars have debated the historicity of Abu al-Barakat and the exact manner of conversion. Some traditions identify the figure as Yusuf al-Tabrizi from Persia, while others link him to Morocco. Ibn Battuta, the famous Moroccan traveler who visited the Maldives in the 14th century, mentions that the conversion was attributed to a man from Maghreb, suggesting that North African connections played a role. However, historical analysis also suggests that multiple Muslim missionaries and traders over time may have laid the groundwork for conversion, and the formal acceptance of Islam by the king was the decisive act that transformed the island's identity. The conversion of rulers often had a cascading effect in medieval societies, as subjects followed the religious orientation of their sovereigns, leading to widespread adoption of Islam. Once Islam was accepted, it rapidly became embedded in the political and social structures of the Maldives. The monarchy was redefined under Islamic principles, with rulers adopting the title of Sultan, aligning themselves with the larger Islamic world. Islamic law and jurisprudence began to influence the governance of the islands, and mosques replaced Buddhist temples as the central places of worship. Archaeological evidence shows that many Buddhist sites were either repurposed or abandoned, while new Islamic architecture, such as coral stone mosques, emerged. These mosques, decorated with intricate calligraphy and wood carvings, became symbols of the new faith. The Friday Mosque in Male, constructed in the 17th century, is a continuation of this legacy, though it reflects centuries of Islamic architectural tradition that began soon after conversion. Culturally, the Maldives' conversion to Islam also meant integration into the intellectual and spiritual currents of the Islamic world. Arabic became an important language of learning and religion, even though Divehi remained the spoken language of the people. The script of Divehi, known as Thana, developed under Islamic influence, written from right to left like Arabic and incorporating numerals and diacritical marks derived from Arabic letters. The Maldives thus entered into the wider Islamic civilization not only in terms of faith but also in language, scholarship, and art. The impact of Islam on Maldivian society was profound and lasting. It provided a new religious identity that was shared with a vast network of lands stretching from North Africa to Southeast Asia. This common faith allowed the Maldives to strengthen its trading relations with Muslim merchants, enhancing its prosperity. Moreover, Islam introduced a new ethical and legal framework that helped unify the islands under a shared sense of purpose and belonging. The memory of Buddhism gradually faded as Islam became the sole recognized religion, and Islamic rituals, festivals, and institutions became central to daily life. The Maldives' unique case illustrates how religion in the Indian Ocean world often spread through cultural interaction, trade, and diplomacy rather than conquest. Its conversion from Buddhism to Islam highlights the adaptability of island societies and their openness to external influences when such changes offered both spiritual resonance and material benefits. Over the centuries, Islam became so deeply rooted in Maldivian culture that it is now considered inseparable from national identity. The Constitution of the Maldives even today requires all citizens to be Muslim, a reflection of the depth of this transformation that began almost 9 centuries ago. The rise of Islam in the Maldives also underscores the broader historical processes of the 12th century, a time when Islam was expanding across South and Southeast Asia. Similar conversions were taking place in regions such as the Malay Archipelago, where Islam spread through trade and missionary activity rather than direct conquest. The Maldives thus became part of this larger Islamic maritime network, serving as a link between different regions and cultures. When one considers the legacy of this transformation, it is clear that the Maldivian embrace of Islam was not only a religious shift but also a cultural and political reorientation. The Buddhist stupas and statues that once dotted the islands are now archaeological relics, reminders of a past era, while the vibrant Islamic culture continues to thrive. The Maldives' Islamic identity shaped its literature, law, architecture, and social norms, ensuring that Islam was not a superficial layer but a deeply ingrained part of the island's soul. This journey from Buddhism to Islam was gradual, layered with legend, trade interactions, and royal decisions. It reflects how the Maldives, though small in size, played a significant role in the history of the Indian Ocean and how its transformation mirrors the broader patterns of cultural and religious change that characterized the medieval world. The rise of Islam in the Maldives remains one of the most remarkable episodes in the global history of religious transformation. Welcome to the channel. Today we will discuss the story of the rise of Islam in Taiwan is often overshadowed by the broader historical narratives of Buddhism, Taoism, and Christianity, but the truth is that Islam, while a minority faith on the island, has left an undeniable and meaningful imprint on its society, culture, and international relations. To understand the trajectory of Islam in Taiwan, it is necessary to explore both the historical circumstances that brought Muslims to this island and the socio-political dynamics that shaped their presence over centuries. Taiwan, lying at a strategic position in East Asia, became a meeting point of various civilizations, and although Islam never grew into a majority faith, its presence represents an important chapter in Taiwan's multicultural development. The rise of Islam in Taiwan cannot be separated from the broader currents of Chinese history, maritime trade, colonial experiences, and post-war migrations, all of which played crucial roles in forming the unique identity of Muslims in Taiwan today. Islam first reached East Asia through the maritime Silk Road and the flourishing trade connections that connected the Middle East with China. During the Tang dynasty, Arab and Persian traders sailed to Canton, Quanzhou, and other port cities, where they built mosques and established merchant communities. Although Taiwan was not a central hub during the Tang period, its proximity to Fujian, a province with one of the oldest Muslim communities in China, meant that Islamic influence was never entirely absent from the island's history. Archaeological evidence and local oral traditions suggest that Muslim sailors and traders might have landed in Taiwan as early as the Song dynasty, though such visits were sporadic and did not result in permanent settlements. Nonetheless, this laid the earliest foundations for the idea of Islam's reach to the island, even if only indirectly. A more permanent Muslim presence in Taiwan became possible after the Ming dynasty expanded maritime activity and after Chinese settlers from Fujian and Guangdong migrated to Taiwan. Some of these settlers were descendants of Hui Muslims, who, through intermarriage and centuries of cultural assimilation, had blended into Chinese society. When Zheng Chunggong, also known as Koxinga, expelled the Dutch from Taiwan in the 17th century, he brought with him thousands of soldiers and settlers from the mainland. Historical records suggest that among his forces were Hui Muslims from Fujian. While few traces of their religious practice survived in later generations, these early Muslim arrivals represent the first wave of Islamic presence in Taiwan that was linked to settlement rather than trade. However, because of assimilation policies, intermarriage, and the dominance of Chinese folk religion, most of these early Muslims lost their religious identity within a few generations, leaving only faint traces in surnames, genealogies, and local legends. The Qing dynasty's incorporation of Taiwan in the late 17th century did little to strengthen Islamic practice on the island. The Qing administration was more concerned with securing borders, integrating indigenous groups, and encouraging Han migration than supporting minority religious communities. Muslim settlers from Fujian and Guangdong who came during the Qing period often blended into the broader Han population. The absence of mosques, religious teachers, and organized institutions meant that Islam during this time was a silent presence, remembered in family stories but rarely practiced openly. Yet, this disappearance of Islamic practice in early Taiwan is itself significant because it illustrates the resilience of cultural memory. Despite assimilation, the idea that Muslims had once been part of Taiwan's settlement remained, even if their religious identity had been muted. It was during the Japanese colonial era, from 1895 to 1945, that Taiwan first experienced a different type of interaction with Islam. The Japanese Empire had its own encounters with Muslim populations in its colonies, particularly in northeast China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. The Japanese authorities were interested in the role Islam could play in the geopolitical strategies, especially in dealing with Southeast Asian Muslims under European colonial rule. Although the number of Muslims in Taiwan during the Japanese period was extremely small, the Japanese administration did conduct some research and surveillance of Muslim communities as part of its broader imperial policies. A few Muslim soldiers and workers from other parts of the empire passed through Taiwan, leaving behind limited but noteworthy records. These experiences, though minor, prepared Taiwan for the next, much larger wave of Muslim arrivals that would permanently shape its Islamic community. The most decisive moment in the rise of Islam in Taiwan came in the mid-20th century, following the Chinese Civil War. When the Kuomintang government retreated to Taiwan in 1949 after its defeat by the Chinese Communist Party, it brought with it around 2 million people from mainland China. Among these refugees were approximately 20,000 Muslims, mainly Hui from northern and western provinces such as Ningxia, Gansu, and Xinjiang. Unlike earlier Muslim arrivals who had gradually assimilated, these new migrants maintained a strong religious identity, supported by religious leaders, institutions, and a collective determination to preserve their faiths. They formed the core of Taiwan's modern Muslim community. The government of the Republic of China recognized the unique needs, and with assistance from both local authorities and international Muslim organizations, the first modern mosques in Taiwan were constructed during the 1950s. Taipei Grand Mosque, completed in 1960, became the center of Islamic life in Taiwan, symbolizing the revival of Islam on the island. These mid-20th century Muslims were not merely refugees. They were professionals, soldiers, intellectuals, and traders who contributed to Taiwan's development. Their presence also gave Taiwan a new channel for diplomatic outreach. During the Cold War, when Taiwan sought allies among Muslim-majority countries, the existence of an active Muslim community on the island provided cultural legitimacy. Delegations from the Middle East and Southeast Asia often visited the Taipei Grand Mosque, and Taiwan's Muslim leaders traveled abroad to build connections. This exchange helped Taiwan secure recognition and partnerships from Muslim-majority nations at a time when it was struggling with diplomatic isolation due to the rise of the People's Republic of China. As Taiwan industrialized and modernized, its Muslim population remained small, never exceeding a fraction of a percent of the total population. However, its influence was magnified through symbolic and cultural roles. The Taipei Grand Mosque, Kaohsiung Mosque, Taichung Mosque, and other centers became not just places of worship but also cultural landmarks. Muslim organizations established schools, cultural associations, and halal certification bodies that introduced Taiwanese society to the dietary, educational, and ethical aspects of Islam. Taiwan's government, in its pursuit of multicultural policies, began to recognize the Muslim community as part of the island's diverse heritage. From the late 20th century onwards, a new wave of Muslims began arriving in Taiwan, not as refugees but as workers and students. Taiwan's economic boom attracted migrant workers from Indonesia, Malaysia, and other Southeast Asian nations, many of whom were Muslim. These workers introduced new cultural practices, languages, and traditions to Taiwan's Muslim community, which had until then been dominated by Hui Chinese. Indonesian domestic workers, in particular, became a significant part of Taiwan's Islamic presence, filling mosques on weekends and establishing their own prayer spaces in factories and dormitories. Universities also began hosting Muslim students from Malaysia, Pakistan, and the Middle East, who added to the diversity of Taiwan's Muslim population. This transformed Islam in Taiwan from a primarily Chinese-centered faith into a multicultural and transnational community. The integration of Islam into Taiwanese society has not always been without challenges. As a minority religion, Muslims have faced difficulties in securing prayer spaces, maintaining halal standards, and educating the younger generation in their faith. Yet Taiwan's democratic framework has given them opportunities for advocacy and growth. Halal certification has become particularly important, both for domestic Muslim consumers and for Taiwan's international tourism industry. In recent years, Taiwan has actively promoted itself as a Muslim-friendly destination, establishing halal restaurants, prayer rooms in airports and public spaces, and government partnerships with Muslim-majority countries. This represents a remarkable shift from Islam being a nearly invisible minority faith to being a part of Taiwan's global cultural outreach. The rise of Islam in Taiwan is also deeply connected to questions of identity and belonging. For the Hui Muslims who arrived in the 1940s, preserving their faith was a way of holding on to cultural roots while adapting to a new homeland. For the Southeast Asian migrants, Islam became both a source of comfort and a bridge of connection with the Taiwanese society that hosted them. For Taiwanese converts to Islam, though small in number, embracing the faith has been a personal journey of spiritual exploration in a society traditionally shaped by Buddhism, Taoism, and Christianity. Together, these groups illustrate that Islam in Taiwan is not a monolithic presence but a mosaic of experiences shaped by history, migration, and adaptation. One cannot ignore the role of Taiwan's Muslims in diplomacy. While Taiwan has limited formal recognition in the Muslim world due to pressures from Beijing, cultural and religious ties have helped maintain unofficial relations. Muslim delegations frequently visit Taiwan, and Taiwan participates in interfaith dialogues that include Islamic voices. These interactions are not only symbolic but also strategic, as they allow Taiwan to assert its multicultural identity in international forums. Islam, in this way, becomes both a domestic religion and a diplomatic tool. The influence of Islam in Taiwan extends beyond religious practice into food, culture, and intellectual life. Halal Taiwanese dishes have emerged, blending local flavors with Islamic dietary requirements. Mosques host lectures and cultural festivals that attract non-Muslim visitors, fostering interfaith understanding. Islamic art, calligraphy, and architecture have added new dimensions to Taiwan's cultural landscape. The presence of Muslims has also challenged stereotypes and encouraged Taiwanese society to think more globally about issues of diversity and inclusion. Looking forward, the future of Islam in Taiwan depends on how the community navigates generational change and social integration. The descendants of Hui Muslims face questions about identity, as many grow up speaking Mandarin or Taiwanese rather than their ancestral dialects, and sometimes struggle to balance modern life with traditional faiths. Migrant workers face challenges of labor rights and social acceptance, but their presence continues to enrich Taiwan's cultural fabric. Converts to Islam represent a growing but quiet voice that shows the appeal of the religion even in non-traditional contexts. Together, these groups form the tapestry of Islam in Taiwan, each contributing to the rise and resilience of the faith on the island. Thus, the rise of Islam in Taiwan is not a story of conquest or mass conversion, but rather one of resilience, adaptation, and quiet influence. From early traders and soldiers to 20th century refugees and modern migrant workers, Muslims in Taiwan have shaped and reshaped their identity in response to changing political and social realities. Their small numbers belie their significant impact, both in Taiwan's domestic multiculturalism and in its international relations. Islam in Taiwan is a story of continuity and renewal, of how a global faith found a home on a small island and how that island, in turn, found new ways to engage with the wider Muslim world. It is a story that continues to evolve, reflecting the broader themes of Taiwan's history, migration, adaptation, and the coexistence of diverse traditions. Thanks for watching the video. Ho friends, today we will discuss the topic the rise of Islam in Congo, a forgotten history. The story of Islam in Congo is a tale often overlooked in the larger history of Africa. where the rise and spread of Islam is usually associated with North Africa, the Sahel, or the Swahili coast. Yet deep in the heart of Central Africa, in the Congo Basin, a region defined by dense forests, mighty rivers, and a mosaic of cultures, Islam carved a path that is both fascinating and complex. To understand this forgotten history, one must travel back centuries, long before the colonial borders of the Democratic Republic of Congo or the Republic of Congo existed, back to when communities along rivers and trade routes began to encounter the Islamic world through commerce, migration, and spiritual exchange. The Congo was never an isolated land, even though its dense geography of forests and rivers created natural barriers. Long before European colonization, long before the infamous rubber trade or the Belgian colonial machine, the region was already connected to a much wider African and global network of interaction. Islam entered Congo not by conquest, not by sudden waves of migration, but through gradual processes of trade, cultural exchange, and adaptation. This makes its history different from the more militarized spread of Islam in North Africa or West Africa. In Congo, Islam arrived quietly, carried by traders, scholars, and travelers who settled among local communities, marrying into them, sharing languages, and transmitting both material goods and spiritual traditions. The roots of this process can be traced to the trade networks that linked East Africa with the interior of the continent. From as early as the 8th century, Muslim merchants along the Swahili coast of present-day Kenya and Tanzania were sailing across the Indian Ocean, connecting Arabia, Persia, and even India and China. These traders were not only commercial agents but also carriers of faith and culture. They established city-states like Kilwa, Mombasa, and Zanzibar, where Islam blended with African traditions and Swahili became both a language of commerce and a vessel of Islamic culture. As Swahili traders pushed inland, they brought with them goods like cloth, beads, and salt, and in exchange, they sought ivory, copper, and slaves. Slowly, these trade routes extended into the Great Lakes region, into areas like Uganda and Eastern Congo, creating cultural corridors through which Islam could flow. In the eastern part of Congo, particularly in the regions bordering Lake Tanganyika and Lake Albert, Swahili Arab traders began establishing commercial outposts by the 17th and 18th centuries. These traders, many of them from Zanzibar or Oman, were Muslims, and wherever they went, they built mosques, introduced Islamic practices, and interacted with local chiefs. Some of them intermarried with local populations, creating hybrid communities where Islamic customs were gradually absorbed into daily life. The arrival of Islam in eastern Congo was therefore deeply tied to trade and migration. Goods were exchanged, but so too were ideas, values, and religious practices. Oral traditions in parts of Maniema and Katanga provinces still speak of the early presence of Arab Swahili caravans and the new practices they brought with them, including prayer, fasting, and circumcision. The spread of Islam in Congo was not limited to eastern regions alone. By the 18th and 19th centuries, long-distance trading networks linked Congo to both the east and west. In West Africa, Islam had already established deep roots in the Sahel and along the Niger River. Powerful kingdoms like Mali and later the Sokoto Caliphate had built strong Islamic traditions that influenced neighboring regions. While the Congo Basin was geographically separated from the Western Sahel, trade routes did connect the upper Congo River to areas influenced by West African Muslim merchants. Hausa traders, known for their mobility and their strong Islamic identity, reached parts of central Congo. Wherever they settled, they built mosques and madrasas, introducing Quranic learning to communities that had previously relied entirely on oral traditions. The growth of Islam in Congo during these centuries was uneven and localized. It was not a sweeping conversion of the population but rather a layering of influences. Some communities adopted Islamic practices fully, building mosques and sending their children to Quranic schools, while others only adopted certain aspects of Islamic culture, such as dress, dietary rules, or marriage customs. This flexibility allowed Islam to adapt to local cultural contexts and coexist with indigenous spiritual traditions. It is important to note that in Congo, as in many parts of Africa, religious conversion was not always a sharp break with the past but rather a process of gradual adaptation, where new beliefs were integrated with old ones. The 19th century brought dramatic changes to Congo, and Islam played a significant role in this era. This was the century of the Great Caravan Trade, when Arab Swahili traders, especially those linked to Zanzibar, expanded deep into the Congo basin in search of ivory and slaves. Leaders like Tipu Tip, a Swahili Zanzibari trader of Omani descent, established large commercial and political networks that stretched from the East African coast into the heart of Congo. Tipu Tip was not only a trader but also a political leader who governed large territories in eastern Congo under the nominal authority of the Sultan of Zanzibar. His presence and the networks he built entrenched Islam more deeply in the region. Towns under his control often had mosques and Islamic courts, and Swahili became a lingua franca. Although much of this history is remembered with pain because of the involvement of Arab Swahili traders in the slave trade, it also marked a period when Islam gained significant footholds in Congo, especially in Maniema, Oriental, and Katanga. The Belgian colonial conquest in the late 19th century disrupted these networks. King Leopold II of Belgium, who infamously claimed Congo as his personal possession in 1885, sought to dismantle the power of Arab Swahili traders and replace it with his own brutal system of rubber and resource extraction. The so-called Arab campaigns, waged by the Belgians, were not only wars against the slave trade, but also wars against the Islamic networks that had taken root in eastern Congo. Many Arab Swahili leaders were defeated, and their territories brought under Belgian control. However, Islam did not disappear. In fact, in some ways, colonial repression solidified Islamic identity in Congo, as Muslim communities turned inward, relying on their mosques, madrasas, and networks of solidarity to survive under colonial rule. Belgian colonialism presented unique challenges to Muslims in Congo. The Catholic Church was deeply embedded in the colonial system, and Catholic missionaries were given preferential treatment in education, healthcare, and administration. Islam was viewed with suspicion by the colonial authorities, partly because of its association with the Arab Swahili traders who had resisted Belgian rule, and partly because of fears that Islamic networks could inspire resistance or connect Congo to global anti-colonial movements. As a result, Muslims were often marginalized in the colonial system, denied access to educational opportunities, and treated as outsiders. Yet despite these obstacles, Islam continued to grow, especially in urban areas where migration brought together diverse communities. By the mid-20th century, on the eve of independence, Congo had a significant Muslim minority, concentrated especially in the east but also present in cities like Kinshasa, Kisangani, and Lubumbashi. These communities maintained ties with the wider Muslim world, through contacts with East Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East. The global spread of reformist Islamic movements in the 20th century also touched Congo, bringing new currents of thought and practice. Sufi brotherhoods, which had played a major role in West and East Africa, established small followings in Congo, emphasizing spirituality, prayer, and community solidarity. At the same time, reformist and revivalist movements encouraged stricter adherence to Islamic law and identity, reshaping Muslim communities in Congo. When Congo gained independence in 1960, Islam was still a minority religion compared to Christianity, but it was firmly rooted in certain regions and communities. The decades after independence were marked by political instability, conflict, and authoritarian rule, but through it all, Islam continued to provide a sense of identity and belonging to its followers. During the long dictatorship of Mobutu Sese Seko, who ruled Congo from 1965 to 1997, Muslims, like other religious groups, were subject to state control, but they also found ways to organize and grow. The fall of Mobutu and the subsequent wars that devastated Congo in the late 1990s and early 2000s had a profound impact on Muslim communities, especially in the East, where conflict disrupted everyday life and sometimes targeted religious minorities. Yet even in the midst of war, Islamic institutions such as mosques, schools, and charitable organizations remain vital. Today, Islam in Congo remains a minority faith, practiced by perhaps 10 to 15% of the population, though estimates vary. Its presence is most visible in the East, but Muslim communities are spread throughout the country. They continue to face challenges, including marginalization and lack of recognition from the state, but they also continue to grow and adapt. Islamic organizations in Congo are involved in education, healthcare, and peace building, playing important roles in local communities. For many Congolese Muslims, Islam is not just a religion but also a source of resilience and dignity in a country that has faced immense challenges. The forgotten history of Islam in Congo reminds us that Africa's religious landscape is far more diverse and interconnected than is often acknowledged. Islam did not stop at the Sahara or at the Swahili coast. It reached deep into the forests of the Congo, carried by traders, teachers, and migrants. It shaped communities, influenced cultures, and provided new forms of identity. At the same time, the story of Islam in Congo is also a story of struggle, of survival under colonial repression, of adaptation to local contexts, and of resilience in the face of marginalization. It is a story that deserves to be remembered and told, not only as part of Congolese history but as part of the wider history of Islam in Africa. Thanks for watching the video. Ho friends, today we will discuss the topic, Rise of Islam in Bulgaria, Ottoman influence and local conversion. The story of the rise of Islam in Bulgaria is deeply intertwined with the broader history of the Ottoman Empire, the Balkans, and the religious, cultural, and political transformations that unfolded in southeastern Europe across several centuries. To understand how Islam found a permanent place in Bulgaria, one must look at the medieval Balkan context, the expansion of the Ottomans, the systems of governance they introduced, the methods of conversion that took place, and the way local populations responded to the presence of a new faith and political order. Bulgaria was historically a Christian Orthodox land under the influence of Byzantium and later an independent medieval Bulgarian Empire. For centuries, Christianity was the dominant spiritual and cultural force, shaping Bulgarian identity, language, and traditions. When the Ottomans began their gradual conquest of the Balkans in the 14th century, Bulgaria was already weakened by internal divisions, regional feudal struggles, and external pressures. This weakening created the conditions under which the Ottomans, a Muslim power rising from Anatolia, could expand into southeastern Europe and gradually incorporate Bulgaria into their imperial realm. The Ottomans did not conquer Bulgaria in a single campaign but rather through a process of military expansion, alliances, and sieges over several decades. By the late 14th century, major Bulgarian strongholds had fallen, and by 1396, after the Battle of Nicopolis, Ottoman control over Bulgarian territories became firm. With the Ottoman conquest came not only a new ruling elite but also the introduction of Islam into Bulgarian lands on a large scale. It is important to note that Islam did not suddenly replace Christianity in Bulgaria. Instead, it was introduced through a gradual process involving the settlement of Muslim populations, the establishment of Islamic institutions, and a mixture of voluntary and coerced conversions among segments of the local population. Islamization in Bulgaria, as in many other Balkan regions, was neither uniform nor total. The majority of Bulgarians remained Orthodox Christians throughout the Ottoman period, but a significant Muslim minority emerged, composed of both settlers and converts. The Ottomans employed several mechanisms that encouraged the spread of Islam. One of the most important was the system of land grants and the settlement of Muslim Turkish populations in key strategic areas. Turkish Muslim settlers established villages, towns, and administrative centers, creating a visible Muslim presence. Mosques, madrasas, baths, and markets were constructed, often becoming central points of community life. In many Bulgarian towns, mosques dominated the skyline, signaling the presence of a new religious and political order. Alongside settlement, the Ottomans used administrative and legal policies that favored Muslims. In the Ottoman legal system, non-Muslims, referred to as dhimmis, were allowed to practice their religion but were subject to certain taxes, such as the jizya. Conversion to Islam offered exemptions from these taxes and opened opportunities for upward mobility in the Ottoman administration and military. For some Bulgarians, conversion was a pragmatic decision that provided economic and social advantages. For others, it was a means of integrating into the new power structure, gaining security, or advancing in careers that were otherwise closed to non-Muslims. Another significant factor was the Devshirme system, which recruited Christian boys for service in the Ottoman court and the elite Janissary corps. These boys were converted to Islam, trained, and often rose to high ranks within the empire. While the Devshirme was not a mass conversion mechanism in itself, it symbolized the way in which Islam became embedded in the lives of Christian communities through state institutions. In some regions of Bulgaria, particularly in the Rhodope Mountains, entire communities converted to Islam over time. The reasons for these mass conversions are debated among historians. Some argue that coercion and pressure played a role, particularly during periods of heightened tension. Others emphasize more gradual and voluntary processes, pointing to socio-economic incentives, local dynamics, and the appeal of integrating with Ottoman structures. The Islamization of the Pomaks, Bulgarian-speaking Muslims primarily found in the Rhodope region, is a key example of this complex process. The Pomaks retained their language and many local traditions but embraced Islam, creating a unique cultural synthesis that still exists today. The Ottomans also brought with them Sufi traditions, which played a notable role in the spread of Islam in Bulgaria. Sufi orders, with their emphasis on spiritual devotion, community, and local adaptability, often had a more flexible approach to religious practice. Dervish lodges, tekkas, became centers of religious and social life, attracting local populations through their charitable works, music, rituals, and teachings. Sufism provided a bridge between local cultural practices and Islamic faith, making conversion a more gradual and less disruptive process for many Bulgarians. Over time, Muslim communities in Bulgaria became well established. Towns such as Plovdiv, Sofia, and Vidin developed substantial Muslim populations, and rural areas with Turkish settlers and Pomak converts strengthened the Muslim demographic presence. This coexistence of Christians and Muslims, while often tense, also led to cultural exchanges, intermarriages in some areas, and the creation of a shared Balkan-Ottoman culture. The rise of Islam in Bulgaria cannot be understood without also recognizing the resistance it provoked. Christianity remained deeply rooted, and the Bulgarian Orthodox Church played a crucial role in preserving Bulgarian identity under Ottoman rule. Monasteries, priests, and local traditions kept the Christian faith alive and often acted as centers of resistance to Islamization. Periods of repression, such as forced conversions or destruction of churches, did occur, but so did long stretches of relative tolerance, where Christians practiced their faith while living under Muslim rule. The balance between pressure and accommodation varied depending on the time period, the region, and the policies of specific Ottoman rulers. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the Muslim population of Bulgaria had become a permanent fixture of the social landscape. Muslims were not a monolithic group but included Turks, Pomaks, Roma Muslims, and others. They lived alongside Orthodox Bulgarians, Greeks, Armenians, and Jews, creating a diverse and multi-religious environment typical of the Ottoman Empire. This diversity was both a strength, in terms of cultural richness, and a source of tension, as identities hardened over time. The 19th century brought new challenges to the position of Islam in Bulgaria. As nationalist movements swept across the Balkans, Christianity and national identity became intertwined in Bulgarian resistance to Ottoman rule. For many Bulgarians, Islam came to be seen not only as a religion but also as the symbol of foreign domination. This perception hardened during uprisings such as the April Uprising of 1876 and during the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, which ultimately led to Bulgarian liberation from Ottoman control. The war had devastating consequences for many Muslim communities in Bulgaria. As Russian forces advanced and Bulgarian revolutionary activity increased, large numbers of Muslims fled, were expelled, or perished in violence and reprisals. The Muslim population,